Session 2, Principles and Practices. Okay, so here's my 6 things. And if you do get my book later, you will see these in the book. So in a sense, you could take notes, or you could just get the book on Amazon, or it sounds like Jim's buying it for you. But these are the 6 principles that I want to talk about. The first one is people give to people they know and trust. And you know, I have had a long history of being in relationship with people. But I often have said that fundraising is all about relationships, right? And so for years, people have been raising their hand at conferences that I speak at and saying, what about Oprah? Can't we just write Oprah a letter? And you know, Oprah is so generous, you know. And for years, I've been waiting, like people raise their hand. And I look at them and I go, well, gosh, Oprah is generous, but you don't have a relationship with her, so this is not a good strategy, right? Now, a couple years ago, there was a woman in the back about where Vince is sitting, and she raised her hand and she said, I was Oprah's first executive director for her first show. Can I ask Oprah? And I was like, yes, you can ask Oprah. But then it's been really fun. Over the last couple months, we've started working with the new ministry called the U.S. Dream Academy, and their biggest donor is Oprah. And so, and she just recently gave them $2 million. And so it was really fun. And they're a very Christian ministry, right? It kind of caught me off guard. Like I didn't think that, but they are a overtly Christian ministry. And so people give to people they know and trust. Unless you're friends with Oprah, you're probably not going to get a gift, right? But when relationships as a core, like for me, I went to seminary. I went to Fuller Theological Seminary, and I got my master's in theology. And when I got to the place where I needed to take systematic theology, I mean, like I had already taken theology and film. I'd already taken every class that possibly could be fun, but I needed systematic theology. I would even put Greek as more fun than taking systematic theology, right? So I finally got around to taking systematic theology, begrudgingly. And in it, I think I learned my favorite point in seminary, and this professor got up and said that God is a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that God exists at his very core in relationship, that God in his core, his being is relational. So he said, so why do we love relationships? Because it mirrors the essence of God. And so when I say people give to people they know and trust, what I'm actually saying is that fundraising done relationally is the right way to go. Now, I know that you all would agree with me, right? I know that you would say, of course, it's all about relationships. But sometimes it's hard to build a relationship. Sometimes you're trying to approach a donor and they won't call you back. Or you keep inviting them to go to the Jesus Film, the crew headquarters, or you invite them to the Jesus Film briefing. You're trying to engage them and they just won't engage, right? They won't even return your emails. So this happened to one of our clients 2 years ago. I try not to use, when I tell positive stories, I talk about the name of the organization. When I say slightly negative, I try not to. So in my book, I actually made a list. There's 80 stories, and about half of them, but I have a key that tells you the actual client. You don't get that, but the story, I did my own fact checking to go, okay, all my stories. But so this client of ours, California, large Christian ministry, he had this incredible major donor. The donor would send in large checks annually, and usually in like the $10,000 to $25,000 range. So that's a large gift for pretty much all of us, right? And so it was the end of the year, and normally what would happen is he would call the donor. The donor would stop into the camp, because it's a large Christian camp, so I'm getting close here to telling you the name. So he would stop into the camp, and then he would give a check. So my executive director calls the donor and says, hey, are you going to be able to stop in like you normally do in December? I'm looking forward to seeing you. What he's really saying is, I'm looking forward to getting the $25,000 gift, right? And so he says that, and the donor goes, no, I'm just way too busy. I'm swamped at the end of the year, so I'm sorry I can't stop by. And so this fairly new client of ours says to me, so I guess we're not getting the $25,000 this year. That's what he said. And I said, well, what do you know about the donor? Where does he live? Oh, well, he lives in Orange County. And I was like, well, isn't that only like 2 or 3 hours from you? He's like, oh, yeah. I was like, well, what does your donor love? He's like, I don't know, our camp. And I was like, well, what else does he love? He's like, and he says, well, he's always talking about some school he helps start. And I said, well, do you ever go to Orange County? He's like, yeah, about every other week. I said, if you called the donor and said, you always talk to me about this school you started, I'm going to be in Orange County, can I come and see this school? And the executive director says to me just what you think he's going to say. That's a great idea, Brad. No, that's not what he said. What he said was, why would I go visit a school? And I said, because your donor cares about the school. And then he says, that's a stupid idea. And I said, and I just paused. And he said, but I'm paying you to tell me what to do, so I'll go and take a tour of this school, or I'll ask him if I can have a tour of the school. So he calls, and he takes a tour of the school. The donor is excited to show him the school. He spends 3 hours with this executive director. And at the end of this tour, he says to the executive director, how's the camp? And then my executive director got to tell him, shared about what was going on and coming out of COVID and all that stuff. And the donor says, well, how's your funding? And he shared with them the chasm. It was about $250,000. And the donor just simply says, well, I'd be glad to give it, right? And so relationships, right? What does the donor care about? Getting in their world. Don't come to us. So my executive director calls me on the way home and he says, Brad, that was a good idea. I was wrong, right? But it illustrates the purpose, the principle that people give to people they know and trust, like entering in their world. And so that's the first principle. It's all about relationships. The second reason people give is because they're asked and shown how. Like, I like this story. I like Nehemiah as a reference point. You know, when we're trying to rebuild the wall, there was a specific cost, and the king and like there was a request that needed to be made, and it was shared in front to the king. And what was really interesting, it was shared to the king and his wife. It says that they asked the husband and the wife together. I love it. But so often we think that people will just give because don't they know that we need $10 million this year to continue doing our work? No, they really don't. Like, and this principle applies to estate gifts too. We think that if a donor is given to us for 40 years, they're just automatically going to put us in their estate. And statistically, no, they don't, right? And so people give when they're asked and shown how. And there is this belief of like, God doesn't want us to ask, and I just pray, and that's good. Please don't stop praying. But my experience has been that when we sit down with a donor and share with them what we're trying to accomplish and invite them to be a part of it and what God's doing through our ministry, that donors understand how to give. Has anybody ever received a letter in the mail like the one I sent in college, where somebody's trying to raise money? Does anybody have a letter in mind? What's a recent one you've gotten? Apparently Vince does, yes?
I do, and I'm not even a plan, but I have it sitting on my desk right now. One of my daughter's friends is at Boston College, and they're doing a mission trip overseas for spring break.
And how much does this mission trip overseas cost? Do you remember?
Yes, all in for all the students going, it's $20,000.
Okay, and you got this letter, and did it suggest to you an amount to give, or did it just announce that they're going and need 20 grand?
It announced that they need 20 grand and that they're going, and they would love for us to pray for them and possibly think about giving money.
Right, and so that letter, awesome. They did the people are give because they're asked. The shown how is missing. I get that letter, and I don't know, do they want me to give $20,000 or $20? Right? It leaves me in a place of confusion, and often, unless they follow up with a phone call and some sort of a range. So we're going to talk about that. As you approach major donors that you have been called to engage with, the asked how is an incredibly important, and we're going to show that in our third session today. The third point is people give when they're involved and have a sense of ownership, that it's more than involved in your work. And we're going to talk about some examples of tours that you should be taking people on. But when my friend Brooke came to my office this morning, she actually brought the staff person that's running the work in Skopje, Macedonia. And she actually brought a person who has committed their life to Christ and is now serving in that community. And that's who came to my office. Have I ever been to Macedonia? Do I have any connection to Macedonia? No. Did I just go on a tour of the work this morning? Absolutely. And so we need to give people a chance to have ownership in our work along the way, and we'll talk about how to do that. The fourth is giving as a way of life. A few years ago, well, one of the things I've observed is that there's really only so many major donors in America who are Christians. And so when we serve the Jesus Film or Navigators or Dallas Theological Seminary or RUF or Young Life or any of the ministries that God has allowed us to serve, there's this Venn diagram of the same donors, right? The same donors who are giving to all those. And they're just incredibly generous people. And a few years ago, I got to meet with one of those donors. And I sat down with him, and I was talking to him about making him a $1 million gift. And we went, it was in a feasibility study interview where I'm basically asking him what he might give to this client if they were to move forward with the campaign. And he said what he'd give, and I said, that's amazingly generous. I said, is this one of your favorite things he supports? And he said, well, it's actually, he said, we support over 50 ministries. And so I actually just then started doing what every good gift officer should do. I just active listened, right? Active listen. So you support over 50 ministries, like he told me I support. I said, and he said, yes. He said, and then he starts in, he says, a few years ago, I was encouraged to figure out how much was enough. And I did, and I figured out how much I needed for me and my wife and all of our children, and we put all that money aside. And then we said, God has called us to give everything else away. And so I said, so God has called you to give everything else away? And he said, yeah. And I said, how's it going? He says, horrible, right? And now Brad, in my stingy, hold your fist tight sort of perspective, I'm sort of going, oh, so you're holding back, huh? That's what I'm thinking. And he says, and he looks at me, and so again, active listening. So it's going bad, right? He said, yeah. Ever since we made that commitment, God has blessed us with more and more wealth, and I can't give the money away faster. And he's living out this image of we're stewards. We're stewards of everything, right? We don't leave this world with anything. And he's saying, I opened up, and God is just flowing money through us. And then he goes on to talk about how he supports 10 ministries at $1 million a year and 20 of them at 6-figure gifts. And, there's just no end to his generosity. And so the giving is a way of life. And as a person in fundraising, we're tempted to try to teach rich people to be big donors. But I would suggest that what we need to do is identify the people that have this sort of we all have different gifts according to the measure of faith that God has given us, right? And so my observation is, who are the givers in your portfolio? And they might not be giving you the largest gift. There might be a really wealthy person in your portfolio who's giving you a very modest gift, but the givers are the ones that we really need to pay attention to. It's a God-given gift. Now, does that person who has a lot of wealth, do they need to be ministered to? Do they need to let go of their stuff? I was meeting with this major donor once, billionaire. He was making a very significant gift to Young Life, and I was trying to encourage him to give a gift to fund all of the work in Young Life in the New England area. So I was trying to get him to give a transformational gift to a very dark place in our country, right? And so I asked him what it would take for him to give a gift like that, and he said to me, Brad, do you know what my new Jaguar costs this year? I said, no, and he told me. And he said, do you know what my new Jaguar cost 10 years ago? I said, no, but it was a much smaller number. And then he said, Brad, do you know what it cost 20 years ago? And I said, no. And he told me a much smaller number. And he said, if I gave a gift like you're talking about, who knows if I'd have enough money to always buy myself a new Jaguar every year, right? So I kind of got chills, but that's not what God's called me to do, to be his pastor. He needs a pastor to help unlock the pain or whatever he's got that causes him to think of his money as his and not God's, right? So this principle, you need to think about your own portfolios and think, who are the givers? And that becomes the greatest question we could ask. The fifth is that no is never forever. Principle that I follow is that you're engaging with a major donor. They're embracing the conversations with you. They want to talk to you. They're taking meetings, and then you present something to them, and they say no. So what do? Well, I want to crawl under the table and die, right? That's what I want to do, right? Because I feel so out there when I'm really convinced that I'm going to die when they tell me no. But what I have to learn to do is that, we have to stay engaged, right? All of us, in a sense, if you look at my 2 verses I put up here to reference this, all of us said no to the Lord and as our own rebellion, right? And yet Jesus stayed and figured out a way to bring us into a relationship with him, right? God, I like to say that the story of the Bible is that God created the world in the first few pages of the Bible, and then the rest of the Bible is what God had to do to put it back together, right? The complex story of putting it all back together. And so when we get told no, our job is to listen, and a no has a context. And, I'm sorry, I can't because. I can't, that's not something, they might be telling you they're not interested in the project. They might be telling you that they have something else going on in their life. But if they've been saying yes to you and then say no, there's a context that we need to understand. And then the sixth point is that proper planning maximizes results and minimizes costs. There is a strategy that you can follow that'll have you not feel ragged like you're on a treadmill. And in my world, what I wish for all of you is that you're following that sort of strategy. Here's the problem. If we really are serious about the gospel and leading every person to faith in Christ, we probably are never going to get comfortable, right? Like, I've been helping the Bowery Mission in New York City for 14 years. The whole time that I've been at the focus group, I've been serving them as a client. They were raising 14 years ago about $500,000 in major gifts, right? They now, this year, are raising $8 million in major gifts. But they're just as desperate to raise money now as they were 14 years ago. Well, that stinks, right? But the reason why they're just as desperate is because they continue to reach out to the marginalized and the homeless who need desperately to hear about Jesus in New York City, right? So that as they raise more, they reach more, right? And so there is no promised land. Like, there is no, if you do great, you get to retire and you never have to raise money again, because what we believe about God, like, we really want, like, I used to say this at Young Life. Young Life used to have this slogan of every kid, everywhere, until eternity. That used to be fun, the line about reaching kids for Christ. And I used to say, everywhere, every kid, everywhere until eternity. Because, like, when we get to the end of the world, we don't have to raise money. Like, that was the goal for me. But so I do want you to have an annual plan that allows you to hit your goal. And your annual plan has lots of things that we'll talk about in a little bit. So those are the 6 principles that I like to talk about as the backbone. So I went through a training when I was here in Orlando with the Edith Bush Charitable Foundation. They have a lot of money in town here. And I'd asked them for a gift, and they gave us several $100,000. But then they also said, we want you to go through this training. And the training was $30,000. I told them I didn't have the money. They said, we'll give you an extra $30,000. And I went through this training with them, and this organization gave me tactics to follow. And they had all these things, like bring people in a room and have lunch, have the whole thing be 45 minutes long, show a video, make sure the video gets people to cry 3 times. At the end of them crying 3 times, get up and give a visionary speech that also makes people cry. And by the way, we want you to test it ahead of time. And then we want you to ask them for 3-year pledges, right? Because that'll work. And we want them out the door in 45 minutes from when they show up. It was all tactics, right? And while it can work that way, tactics won't work forever. Whereas principles, like if you follow principles, you can always say, was this the most relational way? Am I following my plan? Like, am I looking at people and am I identifying who's generous, or am I just trying to chase after a rich person? And so I love to start with these principles because they're the principles that I've been living out of, and hopefully you can be helpful. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to turn to your table, and I'd like you to answer the question of which of the 6 principles did you connect with the most? Like, what's the aha from the 6 principles that you think would be a takeaway? So go ahead and take about 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and I'll put them all back up. Here you go.